So this lecture will go over the American efforts to defeat the Japanese in World War II. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where the Japanese are at the beginning of World War II. So along with the assault on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also used the element of surprise to take Guam, Wake, as well as the Philippines during that period of time. And by mid-1942, they are also in control of Hong Kong and Malaya. They seek these particular cities because they are rich in rubber and tin, and these are resources that Japan needs in order to fight the war. They also control Burma, as well as parts of China. They had started a land invasion of China, and the Dutch East Indies in order to obtain oil. Remember, they had been getting their oil from the United States, but we cut them off, and so they needed to find another source of oil because clearly they needed this in order to power their ships as well as their weapons. So from the Philippines, the Japanese then took the opportunity to invade New Guinea, and they landed on Solomon Islands, and they also wanted to invade Australia. The United States had been aiding Australia throughout the war, and Japan wanted to take this strategic position from us. So a large battle ensues. The United States, along with Australian support, fights a huge naval battle in the Coral Sea in May 1942 in order to try and stop them. The Japanese are stopped at Coral Sea and Midway. They had thrust into the southern Solomons, and they were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal from which they would be able to attack Allied transportation routes to Australia. And then on August 7th, 1942, the American 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, and Japanese reinforcements poured in, and the opposing navies challenged each other in a confusing series of night battles that really battered both of us very badly. We suffered heavy losses, but the Japanese suffered even more losses. They lost a number of their aircraft carriers, and the Japanese Navy would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war. And so the American Marines were helped by reinforcements, and they finally cleared Guadalcanal of Japanese soldiers about 6 months later. And in the Battle of Coral Sea, this was a unique battle because for the first time the fighting was done by all carrier-based aircraft without either fleet directly firing on the other. So here kind of a map of some of the Japanese as well as Allied holdings. You can see the directions of the arrows with the different battles in the Pacific. You can kind of look at that. And then we move to the Battle of Midway. Next, the Japanese wanted to seize the Midway Islands. They were about 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii. And the reason being is because if they captured Midway, they could use this as a base to launch attacks on Hawaii and possibly force the United States to negotiate a ceasefire and maybe even be able to fly planes to the American mainland to bomb American cities. So in the capturing of the Midway Islands, the Japanese are successful in destroying about 3 U.S. aircraft carriers. So the Battle of Midway takes place June 3rd through the 6th in 1942. The Japanese are commanded by Admiral Yamamoto, and he forces a showdown here in the Central Pacific at the Midway Islands. With almost every ship under his command, he heads to the Midway Islands, hoping to render Pearl Harbor completely helpless. And this time it was the Japanese, though, who were the victims of surprise. Americans had unencrypted Japanese code once again, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the American forces in the Pacific, knew the Japanese plan of attack. And so he was able to reinforce Americans at Midway with planes and carriers. So the first Japanese attack against Midway occurs on June 4th. It damages some of the American installation on the island, but at a cost of about a third of the Japanese planes. And so before another attack can be mounted, American torpedo planes and dive bombers had caught 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers in the process of servicing their planes, and American dive bombers sink 3 of them during the first assault. Later, the Japanese would lose another carrier, but not before Japanese planes had disabled one American carrier known as the Yorktown. And then the only other major thing the Americans lost in the Battle of Midway was a destroyer. So this halts the Japanese advancement in the Pacific, and they begin to overextend themselves and start to unravel. Here you can see some graphics showing the Battle of Midway, some of the bombings that took place. In August 1942, the U.S. gains ground at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, despite the fact that we were low on supplies. So this was an airstrip that the Japanese wanted to build near Australia to cut off American support of Australia. So we were successful in that particular battle. The casualty ratio was 10 to 1. For every 1 American lost, 10 Japanese were lost. And by August 1944, the U.S. had control of New Guinea. And we began a campaign of leapfrogging. And so this was an island hopping strategy. What happened was the U.S. went on the offensive in the Pacific. We strategically captured islands, set up air bases on them, and then using them as bases to bomb nearby Japanese enemy bases. So the reason this was successful is because during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which took place from March 2nd to 3rd, 1943, American bombers sank 8 Japanese troop ships and 10 warships that were bringing reinforcements. After that, the Japanese dared not risk sending transports to any points under siege. And so this made it possible for Americans to use the tactic of neutralizing Japanese strongholds with air and sea power, and then moving on to leave those strongholds to then die on the vine. And so this was known as leapfrogging, and it was a huge major cause of Allied victory. And so by the end of 1943, MacArthur's forces are controlling the northern coast of New Guinea as a result of this new strategy. And so here, once again, you can kind of see the map of the leapfrogging. You can see American forces jumping from island to island, cutting them off from the empire so that they sort of die on the vine and they're not able to be reinforced. So the U.S. is able to use the captured Mariana Islands as bases to bomb Japan. One of the more infamous bombings was the massive firebombing on Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945. Overall, it destroyed about 250,000 buildings, gutted about a quarter of the city, and killed over 83,000 people. As the U.S. took New Guinea, they then adopted a strategy to take back the Philippines beginning in October 1944. And this mission begins by Americans landing on the island of Leyte. And so on the island of Leyte, Americans land a massive force on October 20th, 1944. General MacArthur is in charge. You may remember from the Spanish-American War that it was also General MacArthur who was fighting in the Philippines, and so he kind of felt a special protectionism over the islands. And so he waded ashore behind the first landings, and as he got to shore, he issued a very emotional announcement. He yelled, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." And so the Japanese, knowing that the loss of the Philippines would cut them off from the essential resources of the Indies, such as oil, they brought in fleets from 3 directions. They were not going to go down without a fight. The encounters that resulted on October 25th came to be known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And so this is the largest naval engagement in the Pacific. The Japanese lose most of their remaining sea power and their ability to defend the Philippines. And the battle also included the first use of suicide attacks by Japanese pilots who crash dived into American carriers thereby killing themselves, but also sinking or putting out of commission the Allied ships. So they become known as kamikaze units, named for the divine wind that centuries before had saved Japan from Mongol invasion. And they did inflict substantial damage on the American Navy. Okay, so from the Philippines, the Americans then moved to the island of Iwo Jima, and this is invaded by American Marines. It was a volcanic island. It was about 750 miles from Tokyo, and the island was needed to provide fighter escort for bombers over Japan, as well as a landing strip for any disabled B-29s. And it took about 6 weeks to secure Iwo Jima from defenders who were hiding in an underground labyrinth. And the cost was pretty high. More than 20,000 Americans died. The fight was also very costly for Japan as well. Next stop after Iwo Jima was Okinawa. And so this fight began on Easter Sunday, April 1st, and it was even bloodier than Iwo Jima. This island was large enough to afford a staging area for the invasion of the Japanese islands, and so its capture was pretty strategic. It required the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. About 300,000 different troops were used, and the Japanese counterattacks were pretty desperate, and so they inflicted heavy losses. You had kamikaze planes attacking by the hundreds. The Japanese sent the battleship Yamato and 9 other ships, basically the remnants of their great navy, to help aid in the fighters. The American seaplanes intercepted them and also sank the Yamato and 2 other ships. And basically, the rest of the entire Japanese navy was destroyed during this battle. The battle for Okinawa rages into late June and destroys any further Japanese ability to resist. So overall, 50,000 American casualties, and the Japanese lose about 140,000, which include about 42,000 Okinawans. And so when resistance on Okinawa collapses, the Japanese emperor actually instructed his premier to seek peace terms with the United States. But in Washington, we decoded more Japanese messages that suggested that these peace terms were insincere and an effort to avoid unconditional surrender and just stall in general. So now we needed to plan the invasion of Japan because they weren't giving up. So we were going to have to invade the mainland. The invasion could have cost as many as 1 million American casualties and many more Japanese. And so when President Truman was trying to decide what course of action to take, he had to weigh these casualties. Some estimates said that it could take 2 or 3 more years for the Japanese to give up fighting. The Japanese tried to make peace with the Soviet Union, and so that also made us nervous. At Potsdam, which was a meeting of Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, FDR is dead now, Truman, the Allies issue a ultimatum to Japan. They tell them to surrender or be destroyed. The deadline for the unconditional surrender passes, and so President Truman is left with no choice but to strike. All the while, a project known as the Manhattan Project is going on. In 1940, FDR had persuaded Congress to approve a blank check, which ultimately ended up to be about $2 billion that he diverted from Army and Navy funds to the top secret Manhattan Project, which involved over 120,000 different workers. It was a group of physicists who were directed by Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, and they worked out the scientific and technical problems of atomic bomb construction in a laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Albert Einstein had alerted President Roosevelt to the fact that the Germans were researching nuclear fission, and so the Americans certainly did not want to be outdone. So we used our best scientists along with British and refugee scientists to construct the bomb. The bomb was successfully tested on July 16, 1945 in the New Mexico desert. The first test explosion broke windows 125 miles away, and even a blind woman was able to see the flash. Oppenheimer said later that in the observation bunker, a few people laughed, a few people cried, but most people were silent. And after learning of the successful test, President Truman wrote in his diary, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." And you can watch a YouTube video on it. The link is at the bottom there. So the United States decides to drop this newly tested bomb on Japan. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Scientists thought it would only kill about 20,000 people, but when it was all said and done about a year later, approximately 180,000 were dead. 70,000 died instantly. The rest died due to burns, radiation poisoning, as well as infection. 90% of all buildings in the area were destroyed. On August 8th, Stalin enters the war, and so the United States realizes that they need to put an end to the war with Japan very quickly in order to avoid the Soviet Union taking more territory. And so on August 9th, Truman makes the decision to drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. 80,000 are killed in that particular bombing. Now, there's a lot of scholarly debate over the decision to drop the bomb, but Truman never considered not using it. He later stressed, "Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used." He was convinced that using the atomic bomb would in the end save lives by avoiding an American invasion against defenders who he said would fight like savages, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic. So after the second bombing of Nagasaki, Japan surrenders and asks for peace on August 10th with only one condition, that their Emperor Hirohito, who you can see below, be allowed to keep his throne. The Allies accept with the condition that Japan has to be overseen by an Allied supreme commander. And so frantic exchanges ended with Japanese acceptance finally on August 14th, 1945, when the emperor himself breaks precedent and recorded a message announcing the surrender to his people. Even then, a last-ditch palace revolt had to be squashed. And so on September 2nd, 1945, General MacArthur and other Allied representatives accepted Japan's formal surrender on board the battleship Missouri. So the final cost of World War II for the United States, we have about 1 million casualties, which seems like a lot, but when you compare it to our allies, the proportion of Americans that we lost to our population was probably among the least. The Soviets come out the worst, losing about 20 million people. Fewer were killed by wounds and disease this time. Of course, there was hardly any fighting on the American mainland, except, of course, for Pearl Harbor. So America itself, our grounds, our farmlands, remained intact. It was the best fought war the United States had participated in to date, and it created top military leadership. Eisenhower, MacArthur, Marshall, Nimitz would all go on to great hero worship. And then, of course, it created a whole series of skilled industrial leaders. New technologies and products developed for military purposes like radar, computers, electronics, plastics and synthetics, jet engines, rockets, and atomic energy would soon begin to transform the private sector. You had new opportunities for women as well as blacks and other minorities, set in motion changes that will culminate in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the feminist movement in the 1970s. The Democratic Party benefits from the war by solidifying its control of both the White House as well as Congress. And you have dramatic expansion of the federal government, which was, of course, forced by the war but will continue after 1945. And presidential authority and prestige increase enormously at the expense of congressional and state power. The isolationist sentiment that had been so powerful in the 20s and 30s fell away as the United States emerges from the war with global responsibilities and interests that, of course, would continue even today. And finally, World War II accelerates the growth of American power, leaving the United States economically and militarily the strongest nation on the earth.